Good morning, and welcome to your morning cereal. Okay, good morning and welcome to Monday and a brand new work week. I guess I think of Mondays as the start of the week, even though some people consider Sunday as the start to the week. Well, I Googled it, and according to the ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization, ISO Rule 8601. Yes, this is very formal. It has its own number and everything. But in 1971, the ISO established that Mondays were the beginning of the week in daily life and in business, and Monday through Sunday are indicated by the numbers 1 through 7. However, apparently only in the US and in Canada do some people still consider Sunday as the first day of the week. Where do you fall on this most serious of subjects? Hey, also, happy Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day. Let's get into it. Today's quotes, one fun, nostalgic quote, and then a second quote to tease our book review later in the episode. Hopefully, one of these quotes will speak to you and jumpstart your week in a positive direction. Here we go. The first quote is from the movie Legends of the Fall. Quote, "Some people hear their own inner voices with great clearness, and they live by what they hear. Such people become crazy, or they become legends." Man, I really hope I'm in the latter of the two. And today's teaser quote from the book review is, "Good manners are made up of petty sacrifices." That's Waldo Emerson who said that, and as usual, we'll unpack that here in just a minute during the book review segment. But first, let's jump into our usual dose of fun and historic facts from this day in history. Now, today's facts are for January 27th. Way back in 1820, a Russian Antarctic expedition, they discovered the continent of Antarctica. In 1945, the Nazi concentration camps in Auschwitz, Poland, they were finally liberated by Soviet troops on this date. And as such, today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day in 1951 recorded the first atomic detonation at the Nevada test sites. And in 1956, the song Heartbreak Hotel was released by RCA Records, who had just bought out Elvis's contract from Sun Records for just $35,000, by the way. Turned out to probably be a pretty smart move on the label's part, as this song in particular would eventually sell over 1 million copies, and it became Presley's first gold record. And in 1970, the movie rating system modified the M to PG ratings. In 1976, the first episode of the sitcom Laverne and Shirley, a spinoff of Happy Days, it aired on ABC. Do you remember the opening credits where the two women were working in the bottling plant, I think it was, and they put a glove on the bottle? Man, that takes me way back. And lastly, if you were to be browsing the TV guide on this date back in 1995, you would have seen shows like Family Matters, Boy Meets World, The X-Files, and 2020. Okay, let's move on to birthdays. Happy birthday if today is your birthday. You share a birthday with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. As you know, he's an Austrian composer, and he was born on this date back in 1756. Interestingly, he only lived to be 35 years old. Also, Edward Smith. He was born in 1850. You may not know that name off the top of your head, but he was the captain of the RMS Titanic. And lastly, Mike Patton of the band Faith No More. He turns 57 today. Now, to the music and the movies of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. The number one song on this date in 1989 was Two Hearts by Phil Collins. Two Hearts was written for the 1988 movie Buster. Haven't heard of it? Me either. But the movie soundtrack had two number one songs, including Two Hearts and A Groovy Kind of Love. The song Two Hearts won a Grammy in 1989 for the best song written for a motion picture or television. And for Collins, this was his 6th U.S. number one hit as a solo artist and his 5th as a songwriter. I love me some Phil Collins. And the number one movie on this date in 1995 was Legends of the Fall. This movie stars Brad Pitt, Anthony Hopkins, and Henry Thomas, and it won the Academy Award for Best Cinematography. Honestly, I don't remember if I've seen this movie or not, but my wife said she loved it and that we have to watch it. So more to come on this one. Okay, let's start this week off with some personal growth in the book review segment of Morning Cereal. This is where we take a few moments to reflect on lessons learned from the current book we're reading. And we're still currently reading through Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. This is a timeless book, and it's consistently on all the must-read lists, and it's packed with rock-solid advice and actions for us all to use and build healthy foundational concepts to live by. Now, yesterday we started Chapter 3 of Part 2, which was entitled, If You Don't Do This, You Are Headed for Trouble. In the first half of this chapter, Carnegie is hammering home the fact that people are proud of their names, and he's given several examples of successful people that have discovered the importance of remembering and using people's names. Carnegie recounts a story about P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman of his time, who was disappointed that he had no sons to carry on his name. Well, the story goes that he offered his grandson, C.H. Seeley, $25,000 if he would just call himself Barnum Seeley. Now, consider throughout history the honors that have been bestowed on people to have works of art or books and songs dedicated to them. Libraries and museums are named after or have their richest collections named after people. Stained glass windows in most churches commemorate their donors. Hospitals have wings named after them. And Carnegie has a sense of humor about this and a sense of sarcasm throughout the book at times. And to this point, he lays it on a bit thick, saying of people who have their name on libraries, etc., are people that, quote, cannot bear to think that their names might perish from the memory of the race, end quote. Carnegie's just building the case of how important people's names are to them. And Carnegie believes that most people simply just don't take the time and energy to remember names, and often use the excuse for themselves that they are just too busy. But Carnegie asks if we are more busy than Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, quote, took the time to remember and recall even the names of mechanics with whom he came into contact, end quote. And Carnegie illustrated this with a story about how the car company Chrysler had built Roosevelt a special car because, as you recall, Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down. So the car was delivered to Roosevelt by W.F. Chamberlain and a mechanic so that they could teach him how to use it, given it had all these extra gadgets and was not a standard car. And Chamberlain said this of his experience, quote, I taught President Roosevelt how to handle a car with a lot of unusual gadgets, but he taught me a lot about the fine art of handling people, end quote. Well, Roosevelt learned Chamberlain's name throughout the demonstration, and in front of a somewhat large crowd that had gathered to see the car, he continued to use Chamberlain's name, saying, quote, Mr. Chamberlain, I certainly appreciate all the time and effort you spent in developing this car. It's a mighty fine job, end quote. He openly gave Chamberlain appreciation while calling him by name. Now, I know I feel good when the cashier at the local store knows my name, let alone the president. And as the delivery of the car was drawing to a close, Roosevelt sought out the mechanic that came with Chamberlain. The mechanic was shy and kept in the background most of the day, and Roosevelt only heard his name once. But before leaving, Roosevelt looked for the mechanic, shook his hand, and called him by name, thanking him for coming down to Washington. And a few days later, Chamberlain and the mechanic received a thank you letter and an autographed picture from President Roosevelt. Carnegie says here that Roosevelt, quote, knew that one of the simplest, most obvious, and most important ways of gaining goodwill was by remembering names and making people feel important. And Carnegie again asks the readers, quote, yet how many of us do that, end quote. Carnegie reminds the reader, and he knows that his examples have been about politicians here, where forgetting a voter's name is to forget is oblivion, as Carnegie says it. But Carnegie reminds us that the ability to remember names is just as important in business and socially. Carnegie also acknowledges that remembering people's names takes effort. Some people have to write the names down and repeat them to set them to memory, or other people have their own way of doing it. And Carnegie quotes Emerson here, saying that yes, all this takes time, but, quote, good manners, said Emerson, are made up of petty sacrifices, end quote. Carnegie closes out the chapter with a story about how this is not just for presidents and executives, but he uses this example of a factory worker who at lunchtime, he starts using the lunch lady's name, and he got more chips on his plate, and he got more ham on his sandwich. Carnegie ends the chapter saying this, quote, we should be aware of the magic contained in a name and realize that this single item is wholly, completely owned by the person with whom we are dealing, and nobody else. The name sets the individual apart. It makes him or her unique among all others. The information we are imparting or the request that we are making takes on a special importance when we approach the situation with the name of the individual." End quote. And it works with everyone that we might encounter. Here is Carnegie's principle number 3 of part 2. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. Great job. We finished another chapter and we continue to learn the tools to win friends and influence people. So far in part 2, we've learned Carnegie's principle number 1, become genuinely interested in other people. Principle number 2 was smile. And now principle number 3, remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. Okay, come back tomorrow as we'll begin chapter 4 of part 2, and that's entitled An Easy Way to Become a Good Conversationalist. All right, I love that Carnegie's pointers and his advice are so easily digestible, but we can't miss the fact that they can be so materially life-changing if we implement them in a genuine way. Well, I genuinely hope you're off to a great start today, and you feel like your skis are pointed downhill. So have a fantastic Monday, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for the start of chapter 4. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the Morning Serial podcast on the One Life Live It channel. You can find more episodes and videos by visiting our YouTube channel and the website at Sean Inglis and at SeanInglis.com, where you can also follow our other podcasts, the Mr. and Mrs. Inglis podcast and the Life Happens podcast. In these other podcasts, we'll dive deeper into everyday issues, self-improvement and well-being, business and finance, and we welcome special guests too. So join us. It'll be a good time, I promise. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic day, and we'll see you tomorrow.